I only went to the library that evening because the apartment felt too loud with my own thoughts. The heat clicked in the radiators like a tired metronome, and I'd been staring at a blank page long enough to start resenting it, so I put on my navy sweater, the one that fit like a habit, and walked the 3 blocks to a building I trusted to keep its promises. The main room breathed that familiar scent of paper and dust and quiet resolve, and I was halfway to the returns cart when I noticed her, a girl somewhere between 16 and 17, standing in the literature aisle with the posture of someone bracing for impact. Her backpack strap was twisted twice around her fingers, her eyes moving across the spines as if one of them might reach out and choose her back. She looked lost in a way that wasn't about directions, and I recognized it because I'd carried it once, when everything in my life was technically fine and somehow still too heavy. I didn't want to startle her, so I came alongside and said softly, "Looking for something particular or for anything that understands?" She huffed a breath that might have been a laugh if it didn't wobble. "We're supposed to pick a novel for class, and I thought it'd be easy, but..." She flicked a glance at me and away. "I need one that doesn't lie to me." That was a good way to put it. I reach for the book I reach for when I am out of language, the one that steadied me during the year my father was sick and the months after when silence felt like a room with no doors, Stoner by John Williams. "This isn't flashy," I said, placing it in her hands, "and it won't save you with plot twists, but it tells the truth about ordinary courage and the way love and work and failure can coexist without making you less real." When I couldn't stand being comforted, this book didn't try, it sat with me instead. She weighed it like a question. "Is it sad?" "It is," I said, "and honest, and oddly merciful by the end." Something eased in her face, as if the permission to feel complicated things was the recommendation she'd actually needed. "Thank you," she said, and then, as if remembering a protocol no one had taught her, "I'm Lila." I told her my name. She repeated it like she meant to remember, and for a second I had the ridiculous urge to make sure she got home safe, not because she looked fragile, but because anyone choosing truth that young is braver than they should have to be. At the desk she signed the card with a neat, deliberate hand. I watched her tuck the book into her bag like you'd place a letter you aren't ready to open, and then she was gone, and the evening resumed its quiet, and I shelved returns and pretended I hadn't just handed off a piece of myself bound in cloth. 15 years is a long time for a moment to keep breathing, but some do. They slip into the lining of your days and wait. By then I'd moved twice, changed jobs once, learned how to make a decent omelet and how to leave a party without feeling like a vanishing act. I read in cafes I would once have considered too loud and wrote on trains because movement tricked the words out of hiding. I wasn't thinking about the library that Saturday morning. I was thinking about buying a gift for a colleague, the sort of pleasantly impersonal task that makes you feel useful. The bookstore on Birch had stacked new releases in a ziggurat near the entrance, and I picked one up because the cover art had the kind of restraint I trust. I flipped past the title page, and then the dedication caught me by the collar. "For the man in the navy sweater who handed me a book that didn't lie." There are lines that tilt a room. I read it twice to prove the first time had not been wishful hearing. The author's name, Lila M. Harrow, wasn't quite mine to recognize, but the first chapter was a girl in a library lingering in the draft of event because she needed proof the building breathed, a man whose hands knew where the good books lived, a novel that sat with her instead of fixing her. The details were shifted like furniture, but the layout of the afternoon was unmistakable. I felt the absurd urge to look around as if someone might confirm it. Instead, I bought the book, carried it to the cafe next door, and read until the coffee went cold. The prose had that deliberate quiet that refuses to apologize for being gentle. It was brave in the way soft things are when they refuse to harden. And I knew 2 things by the time I closed it at page 70. The dedication had been meant, and I couldn't be content with being an unnamed ghost in her origin story. I asked the bookseller, who had the irreverent patience of someone who can find anything with 3 keystrokes, whether the author did events. "Launch here Thursday," he said, tapping a flyer. 7 p.m. Reading and signing. 4 days felt like a season. I spent them rereading the dedication in case it evaporated, practicing what not to say, and failing not to imagine the face that 16-year-old had grown into. The shop was crowded by 6:45. People clutched first editions like talismans, the air holding that particular buzz of a room about to agree on something. She walked out from behind the curtain at 7:02, and every version of my imagined Lila lost an argument to the one who arrived, late 20s, the kind of composed you get from finding your footing on days that didn't want to give you ground, hair pulled back with the I've got work to do simplicity I have always admired, a voice that carried without rehearsal. She read a section that stayed with the younger self without excusing the system that handed her from house to house. Foster, the word landed like furniture, and when she looked up between pages, she scanned the room with the precise, unhurried attention of someone trained by years of having to read faces. The Q&A was generous and funny and exact. The line for signing moved like a patient river. When it was my turn, I placed the book in front of her, open to the dedication, hard doing a performance I wouldn't have bought a ticket to. "Who should I make it out to?" she asked, pen poised. "To the man in the navy sweater," I said, trying to keep my voice from sounding like a dare. The pen didn't drop. It hovered, then lowered to the table as she looked up properly, the way you do when you've been hearing a melody in another room and suddenly find the instrument. "The library," she said, and I nodded. I could have said Stoner, but I didn't need to. Her inhale was a soft astonishment. She laughed, small and delighted and a little disbelieving, the sound people make when the map folds to reveal a secret path. "I thought you might be real," she said. "But I also thought maybe I invented you." "I tried to be good at vanishing," I said. "But apparently I left a sweater behind." She wrote a paragraph that wasn't for the room. "You handed me a story when I didn't have one yet. This one is for you. Thank you for telling the truth about courage," and signed her full name. "Do you have to run after this?" she asked, glancing at the line. "I'd like to tell you something without an audience." I told her I'd wait. The cafe 2 doors down had the good sense to be dim. We took the corner table by instinct. She wrapped both hands around her cup like she was reminding them to be steady and told me the part of the story the novel had saved for us. The third foster home that month. A social worker kind in the brittle way people get when they have to hurry kindness. The assignment she pretended to care about because pretending had kept her safe. The way Stoner didn't fix the weak so much as approve of her not being fixed. "It was the first time a book didn't talk down to me," she said. "And you didn't either. That's rarer than it should be." I told her that book had kept my ribs from becoming a cage when my father was dying, that a stranger had handed it to me once the way I handed it to her, that I have always believed in the economy of small mercies passed along like useful tools. We compared years without turning it into a ledger. She asked about my work, which is neither glamorous nor terrible, and I asked about hers, which she spoke of with gratitude that didn't require false modesty. We laughed about library signage and the specific sound of metal shelving at closing time. When the barista flipped the chairs to clean, we walked out under a sky that had the good manners to keep a few stars handy. "If it's not too strange," she said, would you be willing to keep talking? Not tonight, necessarily. Just, not every 15 years. "I'd like that," I said, and we exchanged numbers like people who meant to use them. What followed did not hurry, and I loved it for that. We learned each other's schedules and the shape of each week's tired. We traded recommendations the way kids trade stickers. I gave her Gilead and Light Years and the Wild Iris when a Wednesday needed a window. She gave me Bluets and Department of Speculation and essays that made me underline entire paragraphs before texting her a photo of the inside margin like a confession. We texted in complete sentences and sometimes in fragments, both of which told the truth. The second time we met at the cafe, we stayed until the playlist looped. The third time, we walked the length of the river and back while she told me about the teacher who had smuggled books into her backpack, about the family who wanted to keep her but couldn't make the paperwork say yes, about the day she learned home was a verb she could conjugate in first person. I told her the less cinematic parts of me, my tendency to hide incompetence, to organize to avoid, to choose the safe version of joy and then resent it for being safe. She didn't fix me. She sat with me. There were dinners that lasted through dessert because neither of us wanted the draft to close when the door swung shut. There were silences where the room didn't need defending. There were jokes we wrote together in fits and starts until they became the shorthand of a language we were both learning. When she went on tour for a week, I found myself in 3 bookstores picking up her novel just to place it somewhere in the store that made more sense, and she texted a photo from a bland hotel of a navy sweater on the back of a chair and wrote, "Thought you should know your cameo made it to Omaha." I didn't know when exactly affection had started leaning forward, but I could feel it now like a person in the next seat shifting their weight to speak. The night it turned, we didn't plan for a turn. We made pasta at my place because I had an open bottle of red and she claimed to trust my sauce despite all evidence. We ate at the narrow table by the window because the city does better work when it's invited to eavesdrop. She told me a story about a reader who'd brought the book to a signing and cried in a way that made the whole line soften, and I told her about a moment at work that had asked me to choose between being liked and being clear, and how I had chosen clear and then spent an hour wanting to apologize to the air. Music played that we didn't notice and then did. When we moved our plates to make room for our elbows, she reached across as if to adjust the salt, and her fingers grazed my wrist, and I felt the quiet click of a door I hadn't been letting myself name. "Is this allowed?" she asked, not coy, just careful with a life she'd built requiring care. "Only if we mean it," I said. She held my gaze with the steadiness of someone who remembers being doubted and refuses to doubt herself again. "I don't want a story about rescue," she said. "I want one about choosing. About 2 people telling the truth and then staying." "Then let's tell it that way," I said, and when we kissed it felt less like escalation and more like punctuation, like the right mark at the end of the right sentence. What I remember most about the months that followed are the ordinary proofs: her hair damp from rain and my ridiculous umbrella that always flips at the first gust, the way she edits on paper first, with a pencil she sharpens to a surgical point, the way I put the kettle on before she asks, the afternoons we spend in the public garden where we first test read pages to the sound of someone else's wedding photos, the ritual of the used bookstore on 9th, where we each pick a book for the other without saying why until we've both finished them. She met my mother, who cried because she cries when people are kind. I met the teacher who smuggled books and said, "I wondered if you were real." When doubts visited, as they do, like weather, we named them out loud until they lost the sting of surprise. We were careful without being fragile. Once, on the anniversary of the library evening, we went back. The stacks had shifted, but the light was the same. We stood in the aisle where I'd handed her Stoner, and from a bottom shelf she pulled a library card application as a joke and filled it out with the exaggerated seriousness of a child playing office. At the desk, the clerk stamped the date with a thud that felt ceremonial. On the walk home, she said, "You know what's strange? That day didn't change me in a flash. It just tilted the path a degree. 15 years later, here we are, miles from where I would have gone." "The math checks out," I said, and she bumped my shoulder with hers. Her second novel came faster, not because she hurried it, but because the first one had given her permission. The night before it went to print, she slid a proof across my table and said, "Tell me if the dedication is too much." I read it twice, then out loud, then silently again for the private parts, 4M, who handed me a book that told the truth and then kept telling it beside me. "Some doors open once. Thank you for holding this one." I didn't bother pretending I wasn't moved. "It's exactly enough," I said, and she kissed me like punctuation again. When the book launched, the line at Birch snaked to the travel section. A girl of 16 stood near the front clutching a copy the way you hold onto a railing during rough water. Lila signed and listened and asked the good questions, and when it was quiet for a second, I caught the girl looking toward the literature shelves like something there might come down to meet her. I excused myself, walked over, and reached for a spine that knows what to do when asked. "If you need one that doesn't lie," I said, placing Stoner in her hands, "this one sits with you." She blinked the way people blink when a room goes briefly brighter. "Is it sad?" "It is," I said, "and honest, and oddly merciful by the end." I watched her consider the shape of those words, and then she nodded, the first nod of a life that would include this book. When I turned back, Lila was watching us with a smile that understood the economy of small mercies. Sometimes people ask how we met, and it's tempting to give them the short version, the dedication, the signing, the cafe, because short stories are efficient. But the truth is longer and kinder: a winter isle and a girl brave enough to ask for a book that wouldn't lie. A man who had once needed the same truth. 15 years of ordinary days adding up to a surprise. Two people choosing, and then choosing again in smaller ways when no one is keeping score. The library is still there, so are we. On our living room shelf, 2 copies of Stoner sit side by side, one with a library stamp ghosting the end paper from a long ago discard sale, the other annotated to within an inch of its life by the person I love. Between them rests a postcard we pass back and forth like a baton, each of us adding a single sentence whenever the day gives us one worthy of keeping. Most of them are small. The kettle new. We left the window open so the rain could argue with the city. You laughed before you remembered why and then didn't stop. If I ever write a book, I know what my dedication will say. For Lila. For the door that opened and stayed. For the book that didn't lie. And if you're reading this because you found it in a story the way she once found me in a library, then I hope you'll take this as permission. Choose the truth even when it's quiet. Pass along whatever steadied you. And don't be afraid to check the dedications. Sometimes they're talking to you.